and welcome to our little place here, our little tiny West Country Zoo. We like to think that we have a bit of a global reach rather than just being a little tiny West Country Zoo, and I think we do. Anyway, this session is sort of coming out of a session last year and then a whole day in between. I was thinking as I was coming in this morning, it's a bit like, for anyone who's a Monty Python fan, probably aren't. It's like Anne Elk's Brontosaurus theory. It's a very long sketch, but basically the punchline is you finally get to her theory and it's thin at one end, much thicker in the middle, and then thin again at the far end. That is her theory of Brontosauruses. And so this sort of started a bit thin with a 1 hour session at last year's Communicate. Got much thicker in the middle with a whole day spent on this kind of stuff. This is sort of like, in a sense, the thin end again. This is collapsing that day back into 1 hour here, which really isn't enough. Last year we said, this is really good, it was an hour, we'd like to spend a whole day. Actually, when we were spending the whole day, I think there was a sense in the room that this is great, we'd like to do a whole week, or maybe more, we'll see how we go. Also, judging by the number of people in the room, I think this is an area which lots of people are interested in. Not least me, and I'm going to just do 30 seconds on where I've come from on this. So I've worked at Bristol Zoo for quite a long time, about 27 years. During that time, the zoo community has changed a great deal, and we've published 3 versions of the World Zoo Conservation Strategy, now known as the World Zoo and Aquarium Conservation Strategy. This is the latest version, which was published in October 2015. And to summarize them very quickly, in 1993, I'll get it right, 1993, it was essentially about zoos working together globally to do captive breeding. That was their role in conservation. Now, obviously, that was when it was published. The thinking was obviously a little bit further than that, but that was what was in that document. 2005, the document said, no, it's more than that. We're doing conservation breeding where we need to, frogs, etc., that need it, but also we're moving into lots of support for field conservation programs. So we do that a lot as well. That was what was published in 2005, but our thinking had already moved on, and that thinking has now kind of got crystallized in here, because in the third version it kind of goes, yes, captive breeding where we need to, yes, support of field conservation where we need to, but actually, just Bristol Zoo here gets 500,000 people visiting every year. Conservation can't be left to conservationists, because if it is, we simply don't have the capacity to do it. We need normal people, the kinds of people that come for a family day out at the zoo, to also do it. So that's a big ambition of ours here. And that's why it's in this document here. It's now in these documents, but actually I would say we're still at the infancy stage of knowing how the bloody hell we do it. It's an ambition, and I think from discussion with lots of others, it's an ambition of lots of other people working in this field. But we're at the beginning of knowing what and quite how to do it. But it is about people, it's about understanding people. I did a talk at a zoo conference about 15 years ago now, which was basically entitled, Zoos Are Not About Animals. And that was the beginning of my thinking of this, kind of like, actually, we've got to think about the people that are coming in. That's where it's at. And people who work in zoos generally are animal people. It's broader than that. But we need to be people. We need to think about what's going on and how we can get everyone to do the stuff that needs to be done. So that's what this is all about. That's why I brought this over. There's also a whole bunch of other books and things as well, including this one. Which I'm only just reading, I'll just be honest. Okay, put your hands up. Who's read Nudge? Okay. Start it, read it. It's really, really good. And there is a Nudge unit. I don't know whether we should really call it that. But it's a big no-no from the start. The Behavioural Insights team. Michael Sanders is chief scientist there, and he's going to talk to us first. But it basically came out of sort of this kind of book, and David Cameron going, this is the way we can push people doing the kinds of things we want them to do. And we're going to start off with Michael Sanders telling us about the work of this unit and what you do, and that will kick us off. And then I'll introduce the 2 other people as well, and then we'll leave it 10 minutes at the end, hopefully, for some questions and discussion, which we can then carry on over coffee break and dinner this evening as well. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. If that's what you want, you're in the right place. If not, now's your time to leave. We're on. Okay, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you. I forgot to ask if anyone could do anything in order to make the microphone work.
Just speak, I think.
Just speak? Okay,
Yep.
Excellent. Perfect. Sometimes I have to press buttons, which is usually the first step on the path to disaster. So I'm going to disagree with you, I'm afraid, on 2 points. First, I've been conditioned to get cross when people call us the nudge unit, because we do so much more than nudging, but that's just a small one. The other thing I think is So I'm an economist by training, and please don't leave just because I've said that. Economists tend to treat people as though they're machines. We're rational objects where we take in inputs, we go through a constrained optimization process, and then outputs in the form of behavior come out the other end. And so I think what economics has been trying to do over the last 30 or 40 years is try to move to a situation where we do view we become animal people insofar as we're thinking about people as animals rather than people as rational sorting machines, because it transpires that we are not. Otherwise, you guys would not get bored of me talking to you. You would be completely attentive. So I'm going to try and speak for a short enough amount of time that you don't get bored, while recognizing that you are, sadly for you all, organic. Alas, as I said, I'm an economist. I'm trying to think that the machine is the Platonic ideal. So I'm going to talk about the work which you do in the Behavioural Insights team, particularly focused on the things that hopefully you are interested in. And if I'm missing the mark on that, then the good news is because I speak incredibly quickly, and this is a thin, short session, it'll be over quickly. So we were set up in 2010 by the then coalition government. Those of you who can remember Liberal Democrats, it was a marriage of them and David Cameron in the Conservative Party. Nobody seems to have come off terribly well out of that, have they? So we were the first government institution dedicated to the application of behavioural science to policy. I should say as well at this point that I used to be a civil servant, but I am no longer one, which is why I'm able to make jokes about the Liberal Democrats. Lovely people, all the ones I work with. And so David Cameron and Nick Clegg, indeed, in the coalition agreement said that their government would help people to make better decisions for themselves. This is the idea being sort of the big L liberalism, that instead of telling people what to do, we're going to enable them, to empower them to make better decisions for themselves. So if we think about the tools that government normally has access to, we can regulate, we can say you absolutely must not do this, we can ban you from we can ban you from driving, we can ban you from driving specific sorts of cars, we can say you must never take a plane again, probably not going to say any of those things, but we could, theoretically. We can provide incentives, so we can pay for you to do the things you want you to do, or we can incentivize you not to through taxation, the things we don't want you to do. And we can provide you with information. We can say, if you do this thing, it's going to be really bad for you, the planet, animals generally, etc., etc. Each of them have advantages and disadvantages. To the extent that regulation is typically incredibly effective, it also removes individual choice, which our political masters were not quite so fond of. To the extent that information maintains individual choice, it's also very easy to avoid by just ignoring it. If you think about anybody who smokes in this country at this stage, unless they live under a rock, in which case it's very difficult to gain access to cigarettes, they must know that cigarettes are bad for them. We've been telling them for quite a long time, as well as taxing them to maintain their individual choice without some success, but not as much success as you'd like. So my slides have just gone off. So the fourth tool in this toolbox, he said, while suffering from technological failure, is, we think, the use of behavioural insights, which has the advantage of being effective and based on scientific principles, but also allowing people to maintain their individual choice if they want to. And we think that you can use behavioural insights in policy in quite a number of ways, because most policies concern behaviour in one way or the other. So they concern getting people to recycle more. Okay, one of them's working. Getting people to steal fewer cars, getting people to eat less or exercise more, and getting people to cycle in London, because we're London people and we therefore care deeply about cycling, unlike everybody else in the country. Well, we fixate on it. I don't live in London and I don't cycle, so I get cross about cycling. So one of the things which we've tried to do is to get people to sort of set their heating controls more effectively in order to allow them to save energy. And we did this through a combination of different means. Firstly, we gave them leaflets saying, here's how you can set your energy more effectively, you'll save money. And the other thing is we sent a boiler engineer out to have a conversation with them about, basically it's an information campaign with a prominent messenger. And what we found is in the control group, people were using on average 4.6 kilowatt hours per heating degree day in their houses. In the leaflet condition, we just give them this information. We can get them to use 4.6 kilowatt hours per heating degree day. And when we send out that I don't know which one of them is the boiler engineer. I'm imagining it's the guy, because that looks like a uniform, but it could be the lady. When we send out this person who's a boiler engineer to ask them to save their energy, and here's how to do it, we managed to get them to use very slightly, but not statistically significantly more energy. In case anybody's unclear, that's not the right direction. So we think there's a lot of scope for applying sort of perhaps slightly different techniques to get people to change their energy consumption behavior as well as a range of other behaviors, because as it turns out, they're not super responsive to us telling them what to do, even if there's a person there showing them exactly what it is we need them to do. Because when they're cold, they turn the heating up. So we sort of break down these insights into 4 components, which we call the EAST framework. This is if you want someone to do something, you should make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. So what you're now going to see is me try and cram a whole load of research findings from lots of different disciplines into a 4-letter mnemonic, because I am, if nothing else, reductionist. So we know that defaults are really powerful. Defaults are the easiest thing. It's the thing you're in automatically. 70% of people are on the default energy tariff. We also know that if we make processes simpler, so we remove the number of forms you need to fill in when you start in a job center. We reduce it from 14 signatures we need when you arrive at a job center to just 2, one of which is to verify your signature because the other 14 didn't do it for us. We can get more people to start focusing on applying for more jobs, and ultimately getting more of those jobs. We also see that when we send people who are late in paying their tax, we write them a letter because HMRC still sends people letters. Pretty much just GPs and HMRC now who send letters. If we send you, on receipt of this letter, you get a URL to type in. If that URL directs you to HMRC's page where it tells you about tax, then maybe you're going to go to it. If we send you to the page for the tax form you're supposed to be filling in, it turns out about 20% more people, 4 percentage points, of people actually get around to filling it in, doing it. Because you've decided, you sit down, maybe on your phone, maybe on your computer, I'm going to fill in my tax return now, and then you go to the website, it's like, oh, now I need to find out where the actual form is. For want of a better phrase, bugger this, I'm going to go make a cup of tea, and you never come back. So that's a pretty good thing. We also find that substitution is much easier than stopping a habit. So we want everybody in an ideal world to stop engaging in things like smoking. We want them to stop driving. We want them to stop taking planes. That's pretty difficult to get them to do, whereas getting them to make smaller changes, substituting to e-cigarettes, substituting to electric or hybrid vehicles, is much easier to get them to do, sort of a smaller cognitive leap. We also find that if we reduce the friction if we increase the friction around doing undesirable behaviors, we can increase the extent of people do what we want them to do. So if we take away people's trays, then we have a 36% reduction in solid food waste and a 44% reduction in liquid waste. The reason being, when you're choosing how much stuff to get from the canteen, you're anchoring yourself on this tray, and it's going to be really easy to take it back and to carry it around. We're making it so you have to pick up your plate yourself. We mean you actually take the amount of food you're going to eat, and so you waste less. How about how we make things attractive? So we can attract people's attention. We can have a nice thing where they can vote on what I believe are their favorite football players in order to dispose of their cigarettes tidily. We can also think about recycling. So recycling is plateauing at the moment in England. It's gone up, but it seems to be flat now. And it's particularly a problem in London. So we haven't reached our targets. So what we did was we worked with Croydon to try and increase the sort of a couple of things to increase recycling. We sent them a letter to people who had missed their recycling, so they had an empty recycling bin or an unsuitable recycling bin, and we gave them one message that talked about clarification, so did you know all of these rules, and one that sort of talked about the impact of not recycling. So your landfill's going to get filled up, it's going to be problematic for you. And what we saw there was a small but statistically significant reduction in the rate at which people were failing to recycle in future, i.e., put that positively, we saw a significant increase in the rate at which they were recycling the way that Croydon wanted them to be. We can also make incentives more effective. So, for example, we can gamify, this is in Singapore, they gamified the system for commuting so that you've got points for commuting on public transport, and you've got more points if you commuted outside of peak hours. And what we see is that we slightly spread the distribution of peak hours. Singapore has form in this area. They brought in the world's first ever road pricing scheme, which I studied when I was an undergraduate because I wanted to be a transport economist when I grew up and failed. So here I am now. And it was a really effective scheme. We were basically having a congestion charge in Singapore that if you were commuting between 8 and 9 in the morning, essentially cost you a day's wage for the average Singaporean. Really effective at getting people to not drive in that window. What it did was it moved rush hour from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. So people just moved their behavior. They didn't actually smooth it out because the incentive was actually too strong. So this sort of relatively milder gamification does make people slightly more likely to behave in the way we want them to, and it sort of smooths things out, which is what you're actually looking for. Because a lot of the problems caused by people driving their cars in big cities in particular is driven by the fact that those cars are on but stationary and just pumping out noxious fumes all the time. So how about making things social? So we can deal with the fact that, or we can exploit the fact that human beings are animals, and indeed social ones. So we are influenced by the behavior of those around us. So we can get people in hotels, for example, to save their planet by telling them that most other people don't keep their towels being refreshed every day. This is from Bob Cialdini's book, which I think is lying here. So we can tell people you should reuse your towel to save the environment, in which case 35% of people do that. So roughly a third of people care about the environment, even absent of social norms prompt. Telling them most people do this increases that by 10 percentage points. So 1 in 10 people who didn't really care when it was just about the environment will do it because they told everybody else does it. And then we can change that a little bit more so we can make it talking about is this particular room. So we say people in this room, because there's something about being in room 407 in the Avon Gorge Hotel that makes people, this isn't my hotel room, I don't know where all my hotel rooms, just for clarification. Don't want to be murdered in my sleep, or actually don't want somebody else, poor blighter, to be murdered in their sleep. So telling people that people in your hotel, people in room 407 have previously recycled, and for some reason, the machine that randomly allocated you to that room, people feel an affinity for their previous occupiers of that room, and they recycle their towels slightly more. So we can also think about making things timely. So we can think about getting people to recycle by when they go to buy their ticket for the underground. We give them a little thing into which they can recycle because they're already there. They don't have to go out of their way. We can also think about the fact that when if any of you've ever moved home, which I assume most of you will have done at some point, unless you still live with your parents, which is fine. Millennials and all that, I get it. I sort of am one. When you change your home, you have to change a great many things. So your curtains, you have to do a lot of painting, but it's also a good time to change your habits because you haven't got into an ingrained habit that is perhaps negative yet. So it's a good time to alter your behavior. We work with John Lewis to change the displays in their stores on electrical goods, what we could call MDA, major domestic appliances, to highlight the fact that not only is there an upfront price to buying a product, there's also a lifetime energy cost of running it, which isn't particularly salient when you're buying the product. So to the extent that more energy efficient products are slightly more expensive to buy in the first place, we might expect people to buy less energy efficient products to save money, whereas actually in the long term it's going to cost them more money. We just made that more salient to them by instead of saying it's got an energy consumption per kilowatt hour cycle is 1.75, which means nothing to anyone. We tell you if you're using it over the course of over the lifetime of the product, it's going to cost you £551. And what we see is that nobody cares about this unless they're buying a washer dryer. Don't know why. People who are very space constrained, people who are buying washer dryers, which are pretty energy inefficient anyway. But those guys, we see a significant reduction in the amount of energy used by the products that they buy over the course of a 9-month trial with John Lewis. We can also think about getting people to make healthier decisions by getting them to choose their lunches in advance. This is with young people, but we can do it with adults as well. If I ask you now, we're going to have another one of these events in a week's time, who wants to order a salad and who wants to order pizza for their lunch, then everybody, most of you, will order salad because you know that you're virtuous people and you know that future you is super virtuous. If you show up in a week's time like, so we've lost all the ordering forms, what did you all order? Then almost everybody, it turns out, ordered pizza. Because future me is really virtuous and present me is really hungry. This is almost a universal fact. We can get parents to do this for their kids by pre-ordering. Without pre-ordering, 15% of students get a healthy lunch. With pre-ordering, that doubles to about 30%. So it's very difficult to get children to eat healthy lunches. So this isn't going up very far, but it is going up a little bit. And that's got to be worth something, right? So this is sort of a very much whistle-stop tour of a few of our findings on how we think we can make people behave in ways that are in general better for themselves or better for society or better for perhaps the planet by making things easy, attractive, and social and timely. At which juncture I believe I'm well out of time.
No, spot on.
Spot on, magic. As if I planned it. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. We're going to take all three speakers and then we'll basically, because each is going to look at this slightly differently, and then we'll save questions and discussions to the end. So next we have Kris Meyer, who is a neuroscientist, who's going to also do basically what we did at the one-day big version, condensed. This is the tail end of the Brontosaurus. Take it away, Kris.
Yeah, thank you. So I speak a lot slower, and this is going to be a reduction of pace. I spoke last time, and I give a shorter version today of some aspects of the science of how minds change and views become entrenched. And note that I didn't say how to change minds. I'm rather talking about how minds change naturally, and then what we can do with that. So of course, this isn't a new problem. And here's a quote: "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point." Could have been written in 2016 or 2017, but actually it was written in 1956, and it's the opening paragraph of this book by Leon Festinger and co-authors. and is a start of the theory of cognitive dissonance, which is one of the theories that's important in psychology to understand why people behave in that particular way. Listening to Tim's talk made me put this quickly in. Regard for experts has not gone into a sudden recent decline, but is subject to cyclical fluctuations. The resentment from which the expert has suffered in our time is a manifestation not of a decline in his position, but of his increasing prominence. That was written in 1962 by Richard Hofstadter in this book. And the only thing that I did is I swapped the word intellectual for expert. Now, Richard talks about both. He uses both terms. And what happens every time that we are in this cyclical low moment with low regard for intellectuals or people who know something or people who think of themselves as experts, those experts up their game and become better at it. And one of the things we did was drop the word intellectual because it got such a bad connotation. And now we don't use that word anymore, and we started calling ourselves experts. But so we're just a little bit in a dip, and we have to become better at what it is that we're doing to do the things that we think are important to do. Then this happened about 15 years ago, and I put it up here because Tim this morning mentioned fake news and polarization in society. And of course, we're not again in a new situation here. About a couple of months after the Twin Towers came down, polls across Europe and in other places of the world showed that, for instance, in the Netherlands, it was about 30% of people asked thought that the American government was behind it. So that was a very high number in those days. And so there's nothing new about the way that things that we don't believe are true actually can have an impact in society. So I'm going to give you 4 concepts or metaphors that will help you to understand why minds change and why views become entrenched. And the first one is one that Michael actually refers to without having explained it, is that it appears from lots of different research in neuroscience and psychology that we don't have one type of thinking, but at least 2 types of thinking. And those are our intuitions, our intuitive thinking, and our reasoning. Now, our intuitions they're automatic. They happen all the time in the back of our minds without us being aware of it. It's actually the majority of what goes on in our brains. They're experiential, which means they're rooted in our experience. And this is very important because Tim this morning said, like, most of us live in cities now. We don't live in natural environments anymore. And I grew up as a kid in a small town, and in the neighboring village there was a farmer, and we helped to take his cows to the field as a 6-year-old. Now, a friend of mine who grew up in London went for a walk in the countryside one day, ran into a cow on the road, and climbed into a tree because she was so scared of it. So that's a kind of different, the importance of experience. If you haven't experienced this, you will respond to things in a very different way than if you did experience it. On the other side, our reasoning is controlled, which means that we need to pay attention to it. We have limited, it's like a bottleneck, a thinking bottleneck. We can only pay attention to so many things, and at the same time, in the back of our minds, that automatic thinking and processing is going on all of the time. And reasoning also allows us to be analytical and to think about the future, which our intuitive thinking usually isn't very good at. Now, if you have read Nudge or Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, then you will know that they call this System 1 and System 2. My favorite metaphor to understand the way that these 2 systems are working together, or these 2 types of thinking are working together, is this, the elephant and the rider. So you can equate the intuitive automatic thinking to a big elephant, and the reasoning, the little voice in our heads, to a rider on top of the elephant. Now, classically, we believe that the rider is the thing that's in control. That's what common sense tells us. We do the things that we're thinking about. But actually, most of the time, it's the elephant that's calling the shots. And the rider is often limited to just making up the stories for why the elephant is going in a certain direction. Now, there is some something going on that when people find out about these two systems, there's sort of a tendency for lots of people to equate the elephant and the intuitive thinking with bad thinking or with irrationality or with just being a victim of your emotions, whereas the rider is often equated with good thinking, with rationality. That's not really the case. So I'd like to sort of get rid of that particular idea and replace it with something else. So both the elephant and the rider contribute to good thinking and rational decisions. The reason for that is that the elephant is often the result of, specific aspects of the elephant is the result of tens of thousands of years of evolution where a particular response has been really fine-tuned to a situation. So the elephant is what keeps you alive when you're crossing a busy road. That makes you jump away from a car just before it's going to hit you. On the other hand, the rider is not the seed of rationality because often the rider just serves to justify bad decisions or bad ideas that come out of our intuitive thinking. So both good and bad thinking are stretching across those two systems. And so when we're actually designing good communication campaigns, it's about speaking to the elephant. So we're not trying to reach the rider that much. It's already been mentioned a few times today that facts and information don't have that much impact on people's behavior. So we're trying to reach them in a different way by connecting with the elephant. And when it comes to behavior change, we can think about it as shaping the elephant's path. It's much easier to try and ask the rider to control, it's much more difficult for the rider to control the elephant than to shape the path in which the elephant can make better decisions. And the pizza and salad example is a very good one of that. Brief experiment to show elephants in action. I'm going to just play a few little clips. Okay, that's scenario number 1. Here's scenario number 2. Quick show of hands. Who would like the first elephant to be his friend or her friend? Who would like the second elephant to be their friend? Nobody, right? So let's see who else can do this type of judgments.
Look. Hi. Who do you like? That guy? All right.
So these are shows, little puppet shows that they do for infants down to 4 months of age. And by and large, 9 out of 10 of the kids always pick the nice over the nasty. Why there's 1 out of 10 that doesn't, we don't know. Maybe they're not paying attention. Maybe they turn out to be the assholes and the bullies later in life. We have no idea. The point of it is, the reason why I put this on here is because of our concept number 2, social attribution. So that points to the fact that we automatically assign intentions, emotions, and character traits to other things, to other beings. In this case, puppets, like dolls. And that's really important, of course, for us as a social species to cooperate together. If we're hunting on the Serengeti together, and if you're walking over there, I need to be able to understand that we're sort of going after this mammoth together. But it's also important for us to judge whom to trust and who we don't trust in that particular situation. And there's a number of consequences of that for the way that we are engaging in communication on contentious topics and potentially in behavior change. The first one is that experiment shows that our social thinking has its roots in the elephant, in our automatic thinking. Long before we can speak, long before we have that little voice in our head, that the rider on the elephant, the social judgment is already developing inside us. So it's such a central part of us that as soon as basic vision is there, the social thinking exists as well. So that means one positive thing is that our minds are tailored to respond to stories about people. So good communication, as you probably know as practitioners, often means that you have a story of people that your audience can relate to, and that's the thing that really gets a message across. There's a slightly negative side effect of that as well, that stories of people can be used to manipulate someone at the same time. So it's not only positive there. Second aspect is that social thinking can become triggered when people detect stealth behavior change interventions. So if we're trying to change people's behavior in a way that if you were to explain it to them, they actually wouldn't agree with, and then they find out that you're trying to change their behavior, then they might respond very angrily, and it might create a backlash over time. So stealth behavior change interventions could actually lead to long-term, it's a little bit like antibiotics. It has a good use, and it also has a bad use, where it can lead to long-term resistance against the type of things that we're trying to do. And then a very negative side effect of that is that we tend to denigrate those who disagree with us on matters close to our heart. And that's what we're seeing more and more in contentious debates on the internet, on social media taking part. If we are not locked in our echo chambers and we do sometimes meet someone who has a very different opinion on something that matters to us, then we dismiss them as stupid, crazy, or evil. Right, concept number 3, the pyramid. So after the Trump election and the Brexit campaign, there was lots of articles looking at psychology of why it is that people made such an obviously wrong choice, was usually the tone of the argument. And all of those were looking at aspects like confirmation bias and how people only look for information that confirms what they already believe. But there's actually very few explanation of how people come to their beliefs, how they go to a very strong conviction, where maybe a few years ago they had no opinion at all about a particular subject. And so enter this metaphor here, which basically explains a little bit how minds change, how views become entrenched. And one central pointer to understand is that we classically believe that we do the things that we believe in. We have beliefs, and that guides our behavior. Actually, in many situations, it's the other way around. It's our behavior that changes our belief. And that comes from, so if you put that then in action, so suppose we have not a strong opinion on something, but we need to choose. Let's say the referendum about a year and a half ago. And we're not sure whether we're leaning leave or remain at that moment. And we have a difficult choice to make. And at some point we say, like, on the balance of things, I think I'm leaning slightly more leave, or I'm leaning slightly more remain. That's like an initial step of that pyramid. And what our brains are doing in response to that difficult decision is that we start to justify it. We start to convince ourselves that we made the right decision. And so we find additional reasons for why we made that particular decision. And then we take a next step. Our next action is to talk to our friends and family about it. And then maybe we have a fight about it. And that makes us even more convinced to look for reasons for why we're right. And so very quickly, what can happen over either the course of days or months is that we slide all the way down that pyramid. The further down we go, the more entrenched, the more stuck we become in our belief. And the further we go from someone who accidentally almost stepped off on the other side of that pyramid. And when we end up on the end of it, on opposing sides, then really all that social reasoning that I showed before kicks in again, and we start demonizing people on the other side. And so often, in the topics that we're interested in, we're engaging in a political climate or in a social climate in which we might be running into opposition of that kind. Concept 4, value map. So what happens if you ask tens of thousands of people in dozens of countries around the world, what do you care about in life? You get something like this. So you get about 56 different names, different labels for values that are then grouped together in different categories by the authors of this map, Schwartz's value map, this is called. There's a lot of information on this map. What is really important is that the further these points are apart from each other on the map, the less likely people are to name them together as things that matter to them in life. Which means that this map also holds information about the fact that we don't all share the same values. Some people care about other things than we might do here as an audience. To give an example, protecting the environment is up here with social justice, wealth, authority, and social power are all the way down there. So there really are people who are miles apart in what they care about in life. Yeah. Significance of value differences. So those values that we have, the things that we care about, strongly influence that initial resonance that we feel when we see a message, when we see something in our Facebook feed. It either leads us to sort of accept the message that we have or maybe engage with it, click on it, read the article, or maybe we just scroll over it without realizing, without paying any further attention to it. Or it can make us really angry or despondent. It can really take away our sort of agency. And so 4 different examples of climate change value frames that I've come across in my friends even, that my friends are holding, different friends. One of them is we have to change our behavior to save the planet, which is what I suppose quite a few people here in the room will find a very important way of thinking about how we should be solving climate change. Here's another one. Where can I buy the solution to climate change? There are people who are generally concerned about it, but who say, actually, I don't want to change, I don't want to stop flying. One of my friends said that recently. I don't want to stop flying, but I will invest in carbon capture storage because that's my ticket out of having to change my behavior. Then there are people who are, increasingly amounts of people who are starting to say, it's too late, we can't do anything anymore about it, we're going to be gone in 80 years' time. And then there is still a certain amount of people who say, we're too insignificant to have an effect on climate. And all of those framings, those understandings of climate change, come from being in different positions on that value map. Okay, summary so far. Elephant and rider affects everything that we're doing. Elephant and rider are always working together in all of us most of the time. Social thinking, very important for everything that we're doing as communicators and as people who want to instigate behavior change. The pyramid explains us how issues can become contested and controversial, and the value map tells us that we're not all in same positions to start with. Very quickly, 3 consequences. There can be 2 unintended outcomes of communication that we're trying to do. The first one is this. So it can be that we're trying to say something and we think we're explaining something, and actually the audience isn't hearing at all what we said. You could call this the ginger the dog effect. That's how I started using it with people that I work with. Every time we run into that kind of misunderstanding, we say like, oh, I feel a little bit like Ginger the dog here. The reason for that can be jargon, can be words, but not only that, it can be value differences as well. If you come with a framing that's entirely rooted in your values, then it can be completely not convincing or not understandable to someone who is in a very different position from yourself. This is another possible outcome, which is where you anger the elephant, and then any information you have to give to the rider will just fall by the wayside. There are 3 modes of behavior change, and I don't think I have a lot of time to explain them here. One is shaping the path of the elephant. We know that the elephant will make certain default changes or certain automatic decisions, and that's a lot of the work that Michael was talking about. You change the conditions in which we make choices so that the elephant takes better paths through the forest than if they were just to fend for themselves. Instructing the rider is the kind of thing that Alcoholics Anonymous are doing, where they give you cognitive strategies to deal with a certain behavior that you have to change. And this one here is where you can put the pyramid actually to positive use, because sometimes it means entrenchment and opposition among people. But if you can allow people to make a choice and then allow the way that we're justifying our own behavior to ourselves, let that do the work and let that do the big behavior change. So a small shift in the beginning can have very big consequences down the line. Different context for interventions. So when you are trying to intervene in a situation where people generally don't have a strong opinion about something, that situation is very different from when you're trying to deal with that situation where there is strong polarization. And often the problem is that we will be down here on something, and we're trying to do something with people who are over there. And that's almost always going to fail. So, a few links where you can find some more information about this. A report that I co-wrote with a few other people a few years ago on the communication of climate science can be downloaded from the UCL website. A film about people resisting change, about being very convinced but then having to change their understanding, Right Between Your Ears, which I co-produced. And then Mistakes Were Made but Not By Me, fabulous book that contains the analogy of the pyramids, and The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, equally fabulous book that contains the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Chris. And then passing over the baton to Anne Hunt, who today is representing the strategy working group looking at nature connection. And then we'll have some discussion.
Thank you. Gosh, I don't know how to follow those. I'm right down the thin end of the brontosaurus tail is all I can say. So coming at it from a slightly different angle, not from behavioural science, but more from, again, we talked about frames this morning, so talking about different frames. So I'm here representing a collaboration, a true collaboration of funding and delivering this work of both research organisations and delivery organisations that are together really interested in understanding both contact and connection and the implications for policy and practice. And what we're seeing is we had a previous frame, a bit like Anna was talking about this morning. If you provide access to green spaces, people will visit and then they will have concern and act more. But we know that isn't the case, that doesn't work. And we rely on the Monitor of Engagement with the Natural Environment Survey, or MENE, and all that data is available on .gov.uk, to try and help us understand people's relationship with the natural world, how their visit frequency relates to their attitudes and their behaviours. And what it shows us is that visit frequency isn't strongly correlated to concern for the natural environment or to environmental action. So that's not the whole story. Just simply driving visit frequency will not get us where we want to be. It also tells us that valuing the natural environment doesn't then lead to action. So there's that value-action gap. And again, we talked about it repeatedly today, just increasing that understanding of the natural environment, trying to progress that cognitive pathway, that alone is ineffective as well. So what else might be important? A paper released this year, again, delved into MENE to see what else it could tell us. And it does show us that people's concern for the wider conservation of the environment, so that wider sort of societal level concern, is related to how important the natural environment is to their daily life. So how important green spaces are to me in my daily life, and how important time outdoors spent is to me. It's that personal relevance. And that importance, that personal relevance of the natural environment in daily lives is related to the benefits that people report from their visits, much more so than the frequency at which they visit. And that's things like enjoyment and relaxation. So we're way down the spectrum from sort of climate change things. This is just purely about meeting people's basic needs in a daily context. So the paper concludes that enabling people to get those benefits, those daily benefits that meet their need, that builds that personal relevance of the natural environment to their lives, might be an important step. It's not definitive, but it looks like it's an important step if we're going to move towards promoting wider environmental attitudes and behaviours. So it's flagging that not only just quantity of visits is important, but somehow a quality, and that quality is determined by the people who are using those spaces, what they want to use those spaces for. It's not our definition of what quality is. It's absolutely about understanding audiences and what makes it relevant to them. And we noticed that this sort of notion of personal empathy or empathy with the natural environment and relevance echoed the construct of nature connection. Just a quick show of hands around the room. How many are familiar with the psychological construct, the measurable construct of nature connection? Yeah, so not many, gosh. And not surprising, it's only been around for about 10 to 15 years, deeply rooted in psychology. But what it describes, it's a construct, a bit like well-being, and it describes a person's sense of relationship with the natural world. So it's measurable. And this sort of picture on the right-hand side here, in a nutshell. So this describes effectively a nature-connected person that sees themselves as part of nature, and this is a less nature-connected person that sees themselves as somehow separate from nature and having dominion over it. So it fundamentally is a fundamental shift or difference in how people view their relationship with the natural environment. And importantly, why we think it's so interesting is because, again, this body of evidence and literature that's sort of growing exponentially over the years is showing that it either mediates or moderates people's environmental outcomes, their attitudes and their behaviours, as well as well-being. So it's a really interesting construct for us to look at and to understand. Natural England did an evidence summary on this, so again, that's available on the website. It's a short, really useful little summary of about 2 slides about the current evidence. And again, it's already out of date because the papers are coming thick and fast all the time, but it's quite useful. And the thing about nature connection is a bit like well-being. You can have a general sense of nature connectedness, and early experiences in the natural environment are thought to be important in that. And it can go up and down as well. So as you go through life and things happen to you, it goes up and down, a bit like well-being. And that malleability is really important because it means we can change it. And the things that are thought to affect nature connection are the affective, emotional things. So again, we've heard a lot about that this morning. It's not the cognitive aspects of nature connection that are thought to be linked to these outcomes. It's the affective, emotional aspects. So simply giving people information about the natural environment won't enable nature connection on its own, but enabling people to experience the natural environment in an emotional, quite often a sensory way, is likely to lead to nature connection. So there's lots of talk about connection and reconnection and disconnection, but actually this group identified that there was a strategic research gap. We can measure contact with the natural environment through visits, but we can't measure connection, nothing at the national level. The existing constructs, because they've come out of psychology, are quite long, quite complex. You certainly couldn't use them with adults and children in a national survey context. So the group came up with 6 very simple questions as a 6-item scale. Please don't be fooled by the simplicity of the questions, because each one of them is at the tip of an iceberg, so it's theoretically based. And the group came up with them, the academics came up with them to represent a different aspect of nature connection that they thought was important in supporting outcomes. And we piloted it, so we had a quick year's pilot. We validated it against the existing measures, so we are measuring the same construct. And because we piloted it in MENI, so this nationally representative survey, we could see if we could detect difference in levels of nature connection among the population, and we could also look to see if we could see any relationships between nature connection and the other variables or the other measures captured by MENI. And what we found was really encouraging. So in line with the literature, we looked at levels of nature connection and we report it as a sort of weighted points index, and it was positively correlated with environmental attitudes, both those personal ones, time spent in natural environment is important to me, but also wider conservation as well, so concern for wider environmental conservation. With environmental action, so participation in all those sort of nature-based activities that we ask about, all the pro-environmental activities that we ask about too, so that includes those ones that require more investment of time and money, like membership of environmental organisations, volunteering, donating, things like that, and general well-being, again in line with the literature. And from a very initial analysis, it suggests that the correlations are much stronger, considerably stronger, than you see with visit frequency. So again, it's interesting. So obviously, as a measure to be used to us, it has to be able to sort of allow us to cut into the population. So you can report it. We could see a population distribution curve, if you like, very clear differences between the bottom 20% and the top 20% in terms of nature connection scores. So I've just picked out the lower 20% here, much less likely to report concern for the natural environment, much less likely to report being actively involved in protecting the natural environment or being interested in it in those sorts of activities, visiting a smaller number of spaces less often, and interestingly also having a similar demographic profile to the group that we also see that report less willingness to change their ways of their lifestyles in terms of environment. So that was interesting. We couldn't see any real tipping points or thresholds in the middle, but that's the next phase on a bigger data set. And we can also cut it by demographic. And one notable one was the difference by age. So we see it up in children, it drops down in the 16 to 24-year-olds, and it's back up again in adults. So there's lots of things we want to understand better, whether that's a natural development thing or a trend. Now, this is a very simple model that the group came up with to help themselves get their head around what we thought was going. So again, it's a different frame, a different way of looking at things. And what we think the evidence is saying is that if we want to drive societal level outcomes for healthier lifestyles, for environmental sustainability, this box is really important. We have to be thinking about delivering personal benefits for people that drive that personal relevance and concern. And that ultimately depends on understanding people and what they want from these direct experiences. Direct experiences are thought to be very important. You can affect nature connection through imagery and things like that, but these direct experiences are really important. So unless we understand our target audiences and what sort of experiences will make that relevant for them in their daily lives, we won't be able to achieve this. And nature connection is thought to be like a catalyst in the system. So the system can work, cognitive pathway can work, but it's much more effective if you have this nature connection bit in the middle, enabling the whole thing to work quicker and better. But this challenge, obviously, if we want to engage people in direct experiences in ways that are relevant, we have to be able to understand our audiences. And this, again, is just data from Meany. Of the 3 billion visits, so this is just contacts taken every year on average, only a very small proportion of the population are taking a massive amount of those visits. So 11% of the population are taking 53% of the visits. And the flip side is a very large proportion of people are not visiting at all or very infrequently. And you see, of course, this is skewed in terms of demographics. So an average English adult will visit 64 times a year. If you look at the BME population, it's only 27. So this presents a huge challenge for us in terms of understanding the audiences that aren't even having those direct contacts in natural environments, let alone then enabling them to become more connected to the natural environment. So that's it really, so a quick fly through. So obviously the key message is two different things, contact and connection, they're different. We can now measure connection. We think connection is really important and might be linked to, you know, as a stepping stone or a foundation for building environmental action and concern. There's lots more work to do on that model. There's lots of things we don't know. The partnership is growing, so if anyone's interested in helping us test either the sort of quantitative national data or testing that very simple tool in a practical delivery context so that we can really drive that understanding of what works for different people in what context, please let us know. Thanks very much.
Now I'm going to ask our 3 speakers for the last 8 minutes just to come and perch upon these chairs up here. And of course we've planned it such that there's a tea break after this before the next session, so we can carry on discussion and questioning. But here they are, perched in front of you. Who would like to throw a question, a thought, an idea in the direction of this group? Sorry, over there, yes.
I'm just interested, you mentioned well-being in the same breath as talking about nature connection.
Yes.
Is there a correlation of
Yes.
people with a higher nature connection have a higher sense of well-being?
It's one of those, yes, it's one of those very strong correlations. It's thought to be a mediator and moderator of well-being, yes. And certainly we found it in terms of general well-being, yes. So again, it's one of these areas that there's a lot of papers coming out on it.
Is that the same for all the different age groups, even the ones that aren't connected to nature?
We found, we didn't ask the question on well-being of children because Meany only asked a certain number of questions from children, but certainly in terms of adults. And there's all sorts of interesting data, like there's a paper out this week about different types of natural environment having differential effects on on well-being mediated through nature connection.
But being in nature increases people's general sense of well-being.
Yeah. There's some useful Natural England evidence summaries actually on the links between just being out in nature and all those health outcomes. If you haven't come across them, they're useful.
Well, yes.
I was just wondering how you define nature in that context, or do you allow people who aren't universities to define it themselves?
Can you all hear the question? Okay, this is about how do you define nature, Or is it self-defined?
In MENI, there is a definition, and it's very simple, so it's not complicated. So it's a standard definition for nature, yeah, that's read out to people.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Thank you for your talk. It summarises a lot of the evidence really neatly, I thought. We think about putting nature connection into practice in a zoo environment, which we think zoos have a really, really important role to play in this because they sit often on the edge of major living populations. All the nature connection which I've seen, the dose of nature, so to speak, is really quite limited. It's often a green space or an urban park, sometimes a woodland. In the evidence you've seen, do you see if that dose of nature increases in terms of the ecological complexity, that the nature connection outcomes will increase in accordance with that?
There isn't it's an emerging area, so I can't say definitively. All I would say is there is that paper out this week that suggests that more biodiverse spaces may have a differential effect. They may be having more of an effect on nature connectedness. Certainly the level of nature connection, so if you start low, you don't need you don't need a biodiverse space to bring that up. So there's, again, it's the flip, so the little bits of grass growing through the pavement that we talked about earlier, you can still do nature connection interventions in a very urban space.
Yeah, thank you. I'll follow up.
Yeah.
You said in your talk, minds are tailored to respond to stories about people, which is one of the challenges we have in kind of communicating about nature conservation, because we're up against people stories of poverty and disease and all kinds of other things. But it's quite interesting that in your presentation, actually, those toy animals were part of what people respond to and the intentionality. So I'm wondering kind of how we can use some of that insight and how we should communicate about nature.
That social thinking obviously applies to anthropomorphizing as well of animals. So badger and toad are etched in everyone's memories here, I think. And so you can use that. You can use the way that it misfires, because we do it even, last time I showed a video with triangles and circles, and we do it even with triangles and circles. So you can certainly do it with animals.
It makes an interesting point about that, just from my own experience. For a long time, and I had a scientific upbringing, it was always anthropomorphism was a bad thing. Actually, I think we need to move away from that. I'm just thinking of something that happened very early this morning. One of our gorillas died this morning. Now that's going to have an enormous, we knew that she was very sick, and I only knew about it on Twitter actually from earlier on. But that's going to have an enormous effect on people, an affective on people, and actually, because of that connection that people had with this individual animal here, I'd like to do some research to see actually what can we use that connection for then wider environmental concern about where gorillas come from, for example, or do people only fixate on this particular individual, Salome here, who died this morning? I'd love to know kind of how we would research into that. Anyway, yes?
You're saying that when we're at the bottom of the pyramid, it's almost impossible to engage effectively with people at the other side of the pyramid. But I assume, because we're all here, that we're probably all at the bottom of the pyramid. So what can we do?
The pyramid in itself isn't good or bad, so we can be very passionate about what we're doing, but still be trying to be non-judgmental about people who aren't as passionate about the things that we're passionate about. And that's the first step towards reaching out. Another way of dealing with it is thinking that we personally here in the room don't need to reach everybody in society. But if there are big divisions between certain groups, it's never like everyone's in the same space. There's a distribution of people, and there will always be people at the boundary between the two groups. And those are the ones that can be the ambassadors between the groups. And then you bring two ambassadors together, and then those ambassadors take the message deeper into the territory that you can't reach. So that's why the story of this morning of the project here in Bristol is so important, because it's trying to do that. It is going into spaces where there currently are no connections. It's creating those initial connections, and then you hope that those people will take it further towards their communities.
I'd like to ask Michael if you could tell us more about any work going on to make the environmental option the default option, so that it's easier for people to make their own choices.
So there are a number of projects which we're working on in that area. As a general rule, we don't talk about projects that are still live in much detail on the basis that if we tell people they might not work. We do try and be transparent after the fact, though. Otherwise I wouldn't be here, I guess. So we're working with a large airport just outside London, to be specific without being specific, because they employ a small town worth of people, and those people by and large drive into work despite the fact there are myriad alternative ways of getting to that location. So we're trying to change the sort of default settings for those people around their transport choices. That's very, very hard. So we've done 15 experiments in trying to get people to systematically change their transport behavior in a major way, and we have one significant result from the set of them. This is to say that transport behaviors are particularly ingrained. As somebody who gets a 2-hour bus every morning into work, I can tell you that my journey takes an hour and a half if it's a really nice sunny day, and it takes 2 hours and 15 minutes if it's a rainy day, because people are like, well, it's cold, I'm going to get in my car. And so they cause all kinds of other congestion. So we, in transport behavior in particular, we have very little in the way of good evidence of what works, because it's very ingrained behaviors. In other dimensions around recycling, again, we need people to behave in particular ways. We're much more in a conscious choice kind of space. So the best thing we can, I think, hope for is to try and find automatic things. I don't think we have anything in the space of trying to make it automatic at the moment, though. It's a completely unsatisfactory answer.
I'd like to add that the 5p bag charge is actually, I don't know if it was based on actual research that you did, but it's a good example of how you just slightly change the decision parameters and you have a big impact on people's behavior. And if only the government was more willing to implement changes like that, so that would be really useful. We could replicate that in a number of different fields, but as far as I know, there's no appetite for that at the moment.
So I think on that score, so we're up against much less well-defined preferences in that space. So there's not a huge inconvenience to carry plastic bags, or in my case, if you forget to bring plastic bags to wander around the centre of Oxford carrying things. People don't have ingrained preferences, whereas and that's why that very small change in price makes a big difference. In lots of other dimensions, as we see with cigarettes, that people have very ingrained preferences for slowly killing themselves with lung cancer for some reason. So very large changes in price don't make a big difference there. So the plastic bag tax has been phenomenally successful, but we would definitely need a lot more evidence before we were able to say it was something we could apply more broadly. So there might be appetite. We need money.
Governmental approaches is the question. Who wants to take that on?
It was talked about last time in a project.
In the thick bit of the Brontosaurus.
Yes, in a project that happens here in Bristol together with other cities around Europe. And the people who were giving the presentation expressed a lot of surprise at working with a city in the Netherlands where they thought like, well, the Netherlands is also a neoliberal country, so things are going to be pretty much the same as the UK. And it turned out to be very different because people have a very different ingrained conception of what government should be doing or is allowed to be doing. So, and I'm from the continent, and I often run into that difference here. I'm seeing that things that are just without questioning in Belgium, where I'm from, versus how it's impossible to even talk about it here in the UK. And there's a long, long historical tradition that feeds into those different cultural perceptions that we can't change with simple behavioral methods. There needs to be a really big societal conversation about that, and all of us can feed into that.
And I'm going to draw a line under it there just because we have hit time, but I think to summarise it, this is an area of huge interest, obviously, and the number of people that turned up here. There's obviously far more to learn, and I think we basically just need, I'd like to see more sort of budding off bits of communicate that take this and explore it further, because I think when it comes down to our practice of what we're trying to achieve and the knowledge of how people work and the ongoing research behind it, if we can just keep, there's so much going on at the moment, so much new stuff, if we can just keep that communication going, actually trying out new theories in practice and trying to inform practice by new theories, then actually we're going to make quite a lot of headway. But it's all about working together and thinking outside our own bubble, and also recognising, do a bit of self-reflection, that we are all driven by these same things. We talk about behaviour change of other people. Actually think about your own behaviour. be very reflective of what you do. I do it the whole time, and I think, oh, was that the rider? Was it the elephant? What am I wearing this morning? What am I going to eat? Who decided that? Do a bit of self-reflection as well. It's fascinating, but don't do it too much.
Can I make a small pitch here? On 15 November in Manchester, together with Tom Crompton of Common Cause and Happy Museum, I'm running a workshop in the afternoon, a 4 to 5 hour session, in which we're really digging into how do we deal with this current divided society where we're not reaching certain people anymore. So if you want to come along in Manchester on the 15th, come and talk to me and I'll give you the details.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.